welcoming Joan Hostetler to talk about dating and preserving historic photos. So Joan is a graduate of the Photographic Preservation and Archives Management Program at the George Eastman House, International Museum of Photography and Film, and is co-owner of the Heritage Photo and Research Services based in Indianapolis. She's also writing a directory of historic Indiana photographers and is the director of the Indiana Album, which is an organization that digitizes, catalogs, and shares historic images contributed by the public, which I'm sure she'll talk a little bit more about during her presentation. So take it away.
Okay. All right, let me get clipped and we'll get going. Okay, all right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful night. I know it's kind of hard to get out in the summer when it's so nice like this, so I appreciate you coming. I just want to let you know that if you have any questions, speak up throughout, and then I can stay as long as they will let us stay and answer questions and look at any photographs. So just so I can guide us a little bit, how many of you brought photographs for me to look at? Okay, a few. So I'll try to get through this quicker than usual, and we'll have time for that. And everyone's welcome to stay as I look at their photos. So sometimes it's more informative to see the actual items than the slides. Before we go on, you might want to either write down this URL or take a picture of it if that's easier for you, because this PowerPoint program will be up on the web and you can review this, and feel free to share it with others. It's also being shared through Facebook, and a link will be available probably tomorrow sometime, so feel free to share it that way as well. So I'll give you all a moment to take these pictures. And while you're doing that, how many of you have deep Indiana roots? Going back decades. Okay, how many of you aren't from Indiana but are just here to learn more about photographs? Okay, there's a mixture of everybody. So what I'm going to be talking about are photographs, the history of photography as it relates to our family-related photographs. I'm not going to talk about art types of photographs or the more experimental or artistic processes and formats that you're not likely to find in your own collections. So what we will do is we're to go about an hour and a half, so I will talk about the processes and formats, and that's the way photographs are made, whether it's the chemical process, which is how a tintype is made with collodion. I'm not going to get very deep into that. And then the format is basically the size, so whether it's a postcard or a cabinet card, because I find the best way to date our boxes of unidentified family photographs is really to look at those two processes. Then after we get through all that, I'm going to have you look at some other clues, internal clues such as ear shape is one that can help us. Our ears don't change in size, a little bit bigger, but that's a good way to tell somebody as they age over time. We'll look at clothing, hairstyles, and I'll give you some sources for all of that. And then we'll end with how to preserve your photographs. So if you have to leave early, I just want to really stress to save your photographs. These are the most important things in my opinion. Number one, identify your photographs. And it's better to write in pencil on the back, but even I'm grateful if somebody has written on the back in any form, because most of the time you remember your grandparents' generation. The next generation is just clueless, and when they don't recognize people, they throw them away. Although we're right on the cusp of a lot more facial recognition software that will help us identify people as more people across the country share photos of the same people. So it could get very exciting with identification technology. So I think that's even more important than getting the right humidity and environment. But it's a close second. Keeping your images in a cool, dry, and dark place will last, will do wonders for them. You want to avoid mold because all their organic components of your images that little critters love to munch on. You want to avoid heat that will cause cracking of the brittle paper and materials, and the cold is bad for them as well. So those are the main things. If you have to leave, that's the most important thing about preserving them. Okay, now here's my just little brief commercial at the beginning for the Indiana album. We will be here this Saturday between 10 and 4 o'clock, right in this room, right? And doing this scan-a-thon. And what that means is we felt that there was a need to mine these types of collections. I know when I went through my parents' collection, they had wonderful things that I thought, oh, not only are my parents' friends' children like them, but they had pictures of the bank where my mom worked for a long time. They had pictures of small town schools that other people might have ancestors in. So I really checked around, had this idea, nobody else was doing it, and certainly not statewide. So it's just grown. So we have started a nonprofit, and we have a board and volunteers and a lot of staff this summer, and we want to scan primarily photographs and visuals, but we will also take things like matchbook covers, because this is one of the only known photographs of the Northwood Drive-In that we can find, and it'll do until we find better images. We're going way back to the old daguerreotypes. We're also taking postcards and stereo views. But as time has gone on, people come to us with wonderful records such as indentured servant papers or an extremely interesting letter. We will scan that type of document as well. I hate to see it get away, because we've had several times so far where people loan us items, we scan them, and then they have a fire or the next generation throws them away. So when it comes our way, we're going to scan them, and then we make them available not only to individuals who come to us to our webpage, and it's really surprising the number of people who are doing master's thesis on water quality in Indianapolis, and they like seeing a photograph of a washerwoman in the backyard. We have people who are finding pictures of grandparents that they've never seen any photographs that early, cars, motorcycles, architectural styles, it just goes on and on. So here are just a few that we've done of a Crawfordsville area and Montgomery County so far. So this is a postcard, a real photographic postcard, and this one cracks me up because it's fertilizer is misspelled. It's fertilizer used here, but this fellow H.T. Stout had typed his advertisement on the back, and it's postmarked Crawfordsville, and we founded H.T. Stout in the area. Here's the old Wingate School. The Stevenson girls in Linden, Indiana. And this is the hardest part to convey to people. We aren't taking every photograph. We're not taking every cabinet card of great-great-great-grandparents, because honestly, we're not funded to do that. We would love to take every photo like that. But at this point, we're selective about the people photographs. If they're well-known locally, if they're well-known nationally, if they're doing something interesting. And everyday items are becoming our greatest hits. You know, people bathing in the hot, you know, in these tubs. We had one recently from 1984 of a pineapple upside down cake. And we're one of the only in the country that has a picture of a pineapple upside down cake. So anyway, it became one of our greatest hits. Here's another one. The Stevensons had this grocery store in Linden, Indiana.
Who are the Stevensons?
I would have to look in the database again to make sure, but if you go to indianaalbum.com, we go to great lengths to research everybody. So we find them in the census, we take what the family tells us, we check it, because there are a lot of misconceptions and a lot of bad identification written on the back, so we try to make sure. Here's another one that came with others from this county, and I understand, do you say it Lidocae? Is anyone familiar with that name? Lidicay, that is a local name. And to me, this looks like it was just, their barn raising, and they had just a dinner for that. Masonic Temple. Okay, I forgot to write that one down. So in Crawfordsville, it's still standing, correct?
Yes. 1901.
Okay.
They started it.
Okay. And that's another great thing I want to share with you too. We don't have time to look up everything, so we have a robust Facebook page and Instagram and other pages. So if you look up Indiana Album on all the social media, you'll find us. And we had a case recently. It was an unidentified house in Richmond. It would have taken us forever to find where that house was. Within 6 minutes of putting it on Facebook, we had the name of the owners, where it was, current photographs of it. So we have about 10,000 fans so far, and it's like we have citizen catalogers all over the state. So it's just really amazing how this has grown, and we get very excited because it saves us time on research. And if someone gets it wrong, others will correct them. Here's one of our mystery ones. So this Kirkpatrick family lived in southern Tippecanoe, northern Montgomery. What's the county to the... There's another county. Fountain County. So they lived in all of those counties, and so it's unclear to us. We can't find where this house was. So this is one that's still in our mystery folders, and we're hoping to determine. It's pretty distinct, especially the way it's painted, so we feel we might get an answer eventually. And just one more, I think, Ladoga, the main street. So we love street scenes, almost any business, almost any house, across time. Even recent photographs have value because history doesn't have an end date, of course. Okay, so not only are we gathering photographs and making them available, we are geotagging them as well. So eventually we will have a map. You can outline your neighborhood, your township, and you'll get a dot for every image that we've identified from that area. So that's the next phase to get the programmers to help us with that. As well as that, preservation is our mission. So not only preservation of what they're now calling heritage photos, analog photos, the original photographs, and that's why we give these talks. We're also more and more concerned about the awareness of how to preserve digital photographs, because there are a lot of misconceptions that our thumb drives will last forever, that I'll just save it to a DVD. Well, we already know that a lot of computers nowadays don't even have a DVD player. So you have to keep up. I have another talk just on this. You can always call me for information about that, because we won't have time to get into it. Not only the storage, which we like cloud storage and external hard drives, we're concerned that people aren't scanning things at high enough resolution. So here's one, this wonderful it's dated 1850 daguerreotype of a store up in Leesburg, Indiana. And they scanned it themselves and did not scan at high enough resolution to read the sign. So after it was rescanned, you can read everything that they were selling. So we need to encourage people to go at least 600 pixels per inch. And it's ideal if you can save them as TIFFs instead of JPEGs.
Is that the same thing with slides?
Slides, it's much higher resolution. So the idea is you want to get at least 6,000 pixels along the long side when you get your final size. So we scan slides, I believe, at 4,000 pixels per inch. And you usually have to get a dedicated slide scanner, but a lot of the flatbed scanners that have a transparency adapter, a light in the lid, are now going up a lot higher. So again, I can answer that, but at 4,000 PPI, they look pretty good. Okay, so you can find the link when you look at this program again, but here is what our catalog looks like. You can do a keyword search by county, by town, by name, by cats, by banjos, whatever you want to search, and then we have all of the metadata here. So everything that's been submitted by people like you, so over 335 people have loaned items so far. We've shared over 16,000 photographs, and I think it's really closer to 17,000 by now. We're trying to get 4,000 more this summer, so we really need help in underrepresented communities. And so several of the small towns in Montgomery County we don't have enough of, so we'd love to get more of Ladoga and places. So if you're interested in volunteering or sharing, just let me know. And if you just remember Indiana album, that will get you to us. I want to thank our funders. The Indiana Historical Society, with help from Lilly Endowment, has given us money to do 20 more Scanathons this summer. So we are really busy with 5 student helpers who are getting a lot done through September. Okay, so ask me if you have any questions. Sign up if you want to come to that, because we don't want to get slammed all at once, and we want to have time to hear your stories as well. So, just now, going back to the beginnings of photography, a start date for any photograph that you're going to have in your family collection will be 1839 at the very earliest. And you'd be really lucky if you had anything that early. But the earliest processes came about at that date. We didn't have a lot of photographers in Indiana at that point, really not until the late 1840s. But these daguerreotypes, and then a couple processes came about in the 1850s, which we'll go into detail with, were all kept in these little book-like cases. And a gentleman in the back brought a couple of these with him, but I'll show you several pictures. They come in different sizes, from 6 plate to where very tiny ones up to whole plate, which can be about 6.5 by 8.5 inches. And of course, the bigger the image, the more expensive it was. So the average size is more like 2.25 by 3.25, give or take. I'll show you a couple of the types of cases. So the earliest ones in the 1840s and 50s, and even up to the Civil War years, would be a little wooden case covered with a pressed leather or paper. And then in 1853, another variation came along made out of thermoplastic, one of the earlier types of plastics. So if you have ones with the plastic case, your images might be a little bit later. But beware, because people traded out the insert, the photo, for these cases regularly. So you have to look at all of the clues. I recommend that you don't take apart the components like you see on the left, because the images are very fragile and can scratch very easily. But just want you to know that there's the plate, the photographic plate, which was a one-of-a-kind image. They didn't have negatives yet until the late 1850s that they were using a lot for our family type of photographs. So that plate was put behind a little brass mat. It was put behind glass. They taped those together so the air wouldn't go in and tarnish, because photographs, after all, are silver. And then at a certain later date, and I forget exactly, I think it was about 1851, they started putting another little brass preserver in to hold it all together. So what happens is these start tarnishing, like the one you see in the example there, because air has gotten in. But a lot of what I do, in kind of wearing my other hat for our business, is reseal these with an archival paper tape, so they will last again another 100 years without tarnishing more. Is there any way to turn this light off? Is anyone else seeing glare? Okay. Is that okay for everybody taking notes? Okay, great. Okay. All right, so the first process that was commonly made in the United States is called the daguerreotype, and it was named after a Frenchman by that name who perfected this process. And just shortening up as much as I can, for a long time they knew that silver would darken, so they could put a leaf against a silver-coated paper and they could make an impression. fixing it so it wouldn't continue darkening was the problem. So he and others came up with ways to make them permanent. And this was phenomenal. The world celebrated this because, can you imagine never seeing your image in your life? I mean, it was strange to people to see their images. So it took off. Probably 95% or even more of the early images that we're likely to see of daguerreotypes and the cased images were portraits. So if only they had photographed more street scenes and buildings in our small towns. So daguerreotypes are very shiny, like a mirror, because it's a copper plate that's coated with silver. It's buffed, so it's very shiny. They called it a mirror with a memory. And then they exposed it through all the chemicals. They put it in the camera. They took the picture. They processed it. Horrible things like mercury. So if you know the Mad as a Hatter because of the mercury, maybe some of the early daguerreotypists were a little mad too by working with these chemicals. They're known for their very sharp detail. They're almost always reversed. So a wedding ring will look like it's on the right hand instead of the left hand. They're always one of a kind. If you wanted a copy of it, you had to take another photograph, or you just had to make another photograph at the time of the sitting. And they're almost always in these cases in the United States. So this shows the shiny quality of them. I will tell you that behind the glass, sometimes it's hard to tell. If you take a magnet will not stick through the glass and be attracted to a daguerreotype. So just remember that. It will other processes. So they're shiny like this. They're a little hard to see. This is a young Mark Twain he was a printer's devil, and so he had the reversed letters knowing that they would be reversed. So he's showing how clever he was at a very young age. As I said, they were mainly portraits. They could be just the bust. It could be people standing, or like this, multiple people posed together. But start looking at them. They have this tarnish around them, and that's one of the ways you can distinguish them from some of the others in the case. People were disappointed from the very beginning that they were not color, and they tried, but it was not until the early 1900s that we really came up with a good color process. So because of that, they hand colored the cheeks, they put gold on the jewelry and that type of thing. Now, as far as why people didn't smile for the camera, this is one of the biggest myths, I think, and I learned when I was at the Eastman House by reading the photo journals. They told people, even when the exposure was down to 1 second or 15 seconds, they told photographers, do not let your clients smile and look giddy for posterity. You know, you wanted to be seen very serious. You were only photographed maybe 5 times in your life. And there have been some papers written about this, that the progenitor of our early photographs were oil paintings or miniatures on ivory. People didn't smile for portraiture. It's not until snapshot photography in the 1890s that really people smile. So the myths are that the exposure was really long. Well, in the first several months it could be 20 minutes, but they got that down to less than a minute very soon. Sometimes people think it's because they had really bad teeth and they didn't want to smile. Well, young people didn't smile either. It was just the norm for portraiture. So here you can see what it would have been like sitting still. The photographer has the stopwatch in one hand, counting the few seconds. He takes the lens cap off the camera, and almost always, even up to 1890s, there was a neck brace that would hold the person still so they wouldn't wiggle a little bit. But so people were supposed to just look pleasant, but I think a lot of times people just look scared, or just, especially children. And if you can imagine, all galleries were upstairs because they had to have skylights. So they would go up these stairs. In later years, photographers would get behind that black. It probably smelled like weird chemicals. So it must have been a scary experience, even for adults, for a while. As she announced, I'm also writing a directory about Indiana photographers, and so I found the earliest we have here, 1842. We had a professor at IU Bloomington who was making daguerreotypes. He was trying to photograph the moon through a telescope. The nuns who came into Terre Haute and St. Mary of the Woods had a daguerreotypist with them from France. I haven't found any of his work, but he's mentioned. But we had mainly itinerant photographers or daguerreotypists coming in from the east, and they had these traveling wagons, or even along the Ohio River. This is Madison, Indiana, where 1850s Gorgas had his Daguerrean barge, and you can see the skylight there, so people went inside and were photographed. But over time, they started settling permanently in the larger towns and then traveling around in smaller towns. So by the 1850s, you could be photographed pretty much anywhere. Here's another example of one, and if any of you have a lot of these, I particularly love looking at these and dating these, so I'm always glad to help you. You can send me scans. Here's one of a doctor from Rushville, Indiana, Dr. Arnold, but I just want you to know there are all sorts of clues by the mat, the cut of it, the texture of it, obviously the hairstyles, but notice that tarnish around it, and that's pretty common on a lot of these old ones. Another problem with them for preservation purposes is the glass decomposes. So that cover glass, it's called weeping glass, where the salts and sodiums will leach out and they will drop onto your plate and make little spots. So what I advise people to do is get that glass replaced by somebody who is trained in it, or until you can do that or afford that, because it's always so expensive, I like to keep mine glass side down. So just store them flat and glass side down so those droplets won't fall on the plate. But it's really quite amazing just by replacing or cleaning that cover glass. A lot of times the images still just look very beautiful. Okay, so the next process is called the ambrotype, and it's silver-based again, but instead of copper as the substrate, they use glass. And so these start in 1854 and were again used until the early years of the Civil War. There are always exceptions. Old photographers didn't like giving up their old ways, but for the most part, by the early 1860s, they're out of style. They're sometimes reversed, but not always, because they're glass transparent. They could flip them the other way. They're almost always in a case, and I'll show you just briefly about the process. So this is one outside of the case, and you can see they're a little bit muddier. They're not as sharp and clear usually as the daguerreotypes. You can see his cheeks have been tinted pink a little bit. What's interesting about this process and the tintype is it photographs dark yellow or red or orange as black. It photographs blue, even a darker blue, as a light blue. So you can see his blue eyes have gone very, very light in color. So I find it interesting to look at my ancestors to try to figure out what color their eyes were. So that shoots the myth that every time a woman is in a dark dress, she's in mourning. That dress could be yellow, and it will have photographed black. So just beware of making assumptions like that. His vest could have been red or any number of colors. Okay, so basically these ambrotypes are negatives. They're kind of very light negatives. So you can see the bottom of this kind of smiling. He looks relaxed, I think, this Civil War soldier. But if you remove the piece of black that is behind it, you can see that it's a negative. Same here they painted black on the back, or they put a piece of black velvet. The one he just opened up over there had a piece of black cloth behind it. So that's what these are. They're just negatives that are backed. The problem with these is if they're dropped, they can be broken. Or if they paint on the back, that can all be scratched off. So don't try to clean these yourself. I've seen a lot of horror stories. Now then, they got smart about that. They said instead of coating this collodion material on a breakable substrate. Why don't we put it on metal? So they started making tintypes, which were called ferrotypes or melanotypes at that point. It's kind of funny, there's no tin in a tintype. It's actually a sheet iron that has been lacquered with black, and photographers could buy this sheet and make their images. So as we're going all on at time, it's becoming easier for photographers to apply their craft because they can buy more of the materials. So tintypes come along just a couple years later than the ambrotype, 1856. Height of popularity is probably 1890s, but you could still have them done at certain street fairs up until the 1930s. And we're having a tintype or a wet collodion artistic explosion, rediscovery right now. There are a lot of people now who are making tintypes and using it for art and making portraits. So tintypes are almost always reversed, one of a kind. They were in cases at first, but then they started putting them in paper sleeves. And if they're a brownish color, I usually start looking for clues about the 1870s because that was very popular in the 70s versus more of a neutral black. So here's an example of a tintype. And when I was talking about the magnet, if you put a magnet up to the glass of a tintype, it's going to stick. It's going to be attracted. So that's one way you can tell an ambrotype. Well, it won't stick to an ambrotype, a tintype, or a daguerreotype. All right, this is the quiz part of the evening. What gender is this child? Anybody have a guess? Boy.
Is that a kilt?
Yes, you're seeing all sorts of things. Okay, those of you who guessed boy are right. And because children were kept in skirts because it was easier to change their diapers when they were in these skirts, boys wore skirts sometimes until 3, sometimes until 5 years old. And so it was called being breeched because you got to a certain age, you could start wearing breeches. At that time, they often started cutting their hair. So little boys had long hair. The way you can tell is boys almost always have a side part, girls have a center part. So that's really handy with your mystery baby photographs to at least narrow it down. And I've looked and looked since I heard that clue, and I've never found an exception in these early child photographs. Okay, you mentioned the pink.
What's with the pink?
Yeah, you mentioned the pink shoelaces. This is just an example, I think, of some creative retoucher or photographer. It would have been done at the time, but for some reason they decided the pink shoelaces would add to the image. He had a little bit of pink on his cheeks as well. And I don't know if that's a kilt or not. It possibly was, but it could have just been the style as well. Okay, so we haven't talked about prices of these. In the very beginning of daguerreotypes, it was usually $1 and even up to $5 in Indiana to have your daguerreotype portrait made. The little ones were $1, and Calvin Fletcher of Fletcher Bank in Indianapolis, he wrote in his diary he had one made for $5, but it was big, it was a fancy frame, it was the best photographer. The prices kept about that same range until the tintype era, and at this point you could have one camera that had multiple lenses, or they called them tubes, on the front. They could take one large tintype plate, put it in the camera, and in one sitting make 4 images, 16, even 32 little photographs on one plate. So that's why you see here, walk in and have 6 ferrotypes made for 25 cents. So the price went down, and then they would simply process them like normal and cut them apart with tin snips. You can see the neck brace on that boy. I think that's a good example of it. So with the cost going down, prices, you could get a lot of images and you could start sharing them with friends or family or neighbors or whoever. So I think people started relaxing a little bit more for the camera. Not that they didn't use daguerreotypes for other purposes. Within months of the daguerreotype being invented, they were making pornographic daguerreotypes in Paris. They were also using it for documentary photography of wars and fires and that type of thing. But for the most part, it was portraiture. With tintypes, we start seeing things like this. This is a Muncie area photographer. I think there was a little bit showy and kind of artistic with his little top hat there. This is his tent at a fair. You can see his display of what he's selling. And he could be making images like this where you pose behind props and you know, they had kind of fun images. With the Civil War, they started coating tintypes with varnish. They didn't protect them in glass in the cases. They started putting varnish over them so they wouldn't tarnish. And they did that, and it took off at that point because during the Civil War there were a lot of photographs going back and forth from where they're fighting to the loved ones at home, and they were being sent in the mail. So they started putting them in, this one's later, but they started putting tintypes in little sleeves like this. And it's really important, even though it's an acidic paper sleeve, keep that sleeve because that is your dating clue of where it was taken, when this style was made, etc. And here's another local example that came in to the Indiana album. This was a man, it just said truly J. Ellis, and he said drummer for, is a Company D, the 63rd Indiana. Well, the family told us they had his drumsticks as a souvenir also. And we looked him up and found it was John N. Ellis. I'm always happy when they survive the war. And in none of the records does it say he was a drummer or musician, but we have through this record, and you know, that's how he signed it. That's how he saw himself. So this is one during the Civil War, and if you look close under magnification, embossed on the edge, there's a patent date of 1863 or something like that. So always look with close, good light with magnification because there are all sorts of clues on your images that can narrow down the date. Backdrops, this needs to be a thesis if it's not already. Backdrops is another really good way to help you date your images. And in general, the earlier images are plain. They had real wooden props. They had Brussels carpets and curtains and that type of thing. As time went on and photographers realized they needed to swap out props, not everybody wanted the same backdrop. They started getting paper mache props. They started getting these painted backdrops that could be rolled down for the different images. Interestingly enough, I saw some of these at the Eastman House, and they're in gray. They're painted in gray because they didn't need color for the backdrop, so who knew? But by the 1880s, 70s and 80s, they started getting very garish and Victorian and lots of furniture, and then it tones down again after 1900. Okay, the different types of images. This one happens to be a tintype, but how many of you have post-mortem photographs of your ancestors? It was a fairly common thing to do, even more understandably at the beginning of photography, because you can imagine your loved one dies in 1841, you wouldn't have any photograph of them. So daguerreotypists advertised they would come to your home as soon as they could and take a photograph of your loved one before they were buried. But it continued long after that, and even up to about 1920, where you see these changing through, sometimes they made them look awake. They posed children with toys. Sometimes their hands are tied together before rigor mortis sets in. Then they started making them look like they were asleep, and by the 20s and teens, they were in their coffin usually. And one of my favorite incidences from talking as a little group of teenagers, 13-year-olds, came to one of my talks. They were all Hispanic, and I didn't think they would like any of this at all, but they loved this concept because one said his grandmother had just died, and he was at her funeral, and he took a selfie of himself with her coffin. And I said, well, what did your parents think about that? And they said, well, they didn't like it, but why not? We photograph everything. It would be weird not to photograph it. So I think now we're starting to see a time where maybe younger people will start photographing dying and deceased people again. So we'll see where the trend goes. Here are just a couple extras. I realized I have too many good examples, so I just want you to see that these tintypes, they get rusty. You really need to make sure that you put them in paper sleeves. Don't just throw them in a box because they have bent corners. They scratch each other. You don't want to put them in plastic because Mylar has a electrostatic quality, and if they're flaking, it takes some of those flakes off. So you have to be careful with how you store these. Also, I like this one because in the 1880s, they have those weird paper mache rocks and things that are just very odd. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through the negatives because there were different types. The earliest ones were glass. The later ones were plastic, and I really need to change this present because when's the last any of us took a negative? Sometimes I find purists who do that, but by the time of the digital age, we all started with digital photography. So just to get the idea, it was not easy to make these glass negatives when they first started. It was called wet collodion because they had to polish their glass, polish the edges. They had to coat it with this collodion. It looks like Karo syrup. They had to pour it on their plate, get it evenly distributed. They had to dip it into their silver nitrate or whatever the light chemical was to make it light sensitive. Then they had to get it in the camera, take the picture, and get it back and develop it before that plate dried. If it dried, it would lose its light sensitivity. So it gives you a real great appreciation for the photographers who went out in Yosemite and those early, climbing mountains with their mules and glass bottles of all of this to get those large images. Until recently, I hadn't seen many of these wet collodion images in Indiana. There's one at the Indiana Historical Society of Abraham Lincoln.
Can I say something?
Of course, yeah.
I had heard that the Indiana Historical Society bought a CERN photograph of Abraham Lincoln for $500,000. Is that the photo?
It is. It is. So I think there were other items that were with that collection, but they bought it from, I think I'm right by saying it was by Alexander Gardner, the famous Civil War photographer, and this was bought from a Chicago collector, but I don't know the exact amount, but it was 10 times more than my house probably, so yes.
I'm curious about this photo where the person is preparing the plate
Yeah.
for a photograph, and if they did this in the field, they had to do it in the dark, right?
Yeah, up until this point, they could do it in the light. So they would usually have tents, or they even made little carts on wheels that would have a place to put your eyes in and to reach in and to do part of it. So they were very creative about how to keep it dark when they're out in the field. And then after this stage, it had to stay in the dark. It could have a little bit of red light. They took the photograph, and then after they did the processing, it was no longer light sensitive, so they could finish out the process. And if anyone's interested, the George Eastman House, or it's now called the George Eastman Museum, has wonderful workshops on how to make all these processes. So it's really enlightening to see how they've rediscovered all of these wonderful processes. Yeah, but that was one of the few in the state. But a few years ago, I got a call from the Greensburg Library. That's the one with the tree, right? And they were given these glass negatives that were found in the attic by roofers who were working on a store in the courthouse square. So they were taking off the roof, and they found these just between the joist, not in a box, so they were stacked on each other. It ended up that they found 400 of these plates 3 photographers had been located in this studio, and for some reason they put their plates from the 1860s through 1880s up in the attic. They were up there, 150, 60 years, and survived. Your DVDs wouldn't do that, so that's just your warning. So anyway, it was one of my favorite projects. We were able to clean them and scan them for them. And so that's just the scan before we cleaned it. We cleaned it very carefully. I checked with every photo conservator I knew to make sure we were doing this right, because they had years of soot and bird droppings and feathers and all on top of these. And we were able to not do all of them, but a lot of the best ones. And there's a lot of digital work that they need to have done yet. What was exciting is sometimes there would be a name written on them. And here's an example of one. So here's the name. We would reverse them. After putting it in the newspaper, family came forward and said, yes, that's my ancestor, Maury Arnold, from nearby Rush County, and he did survive the war, and they'd never seen a photograph of him in his uniform. So it was just a wonderful project. My dream is that these are in attics all over the state. Good question.
Now, you said that like the colorization of these old ones, so a Union soldier, the blue uniform, it looks very dark or very light? I kind of forgot.
Let me see, the blue would look lighter. Yeah, so he's, it depends on the shade.
Gray would look like a Southern Confederate soldier, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I'm not really sure. I don't look at a lot of the Confederate images, and generally Civil War uniforms were darker blue. You hear from the museum probably know more about this. They were darker blue uniforms, so they probably photographed. Oh, there we go, right next to me. That darker navy would photograph fairly dark, so I'm guessing that's what color this would be. I'm guessing you have some you need help with.
Well, I do, and it's interesting. The man actually had family in southern Indiana. He lived in Alabama. He came up here to fight, as I was told.
Oh.
After the war, he waited a couple of years, moved back to Alabama.
Oh,
So
interesting.
we have a picture of him,
Yeah,
and it's
about that color.
And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, am I hearing the truth or not?
Well, and they vary by unit too, and I'm certainly not an expert, but I'm sure you have books here. On the library would have books on uniforms as well. Okay, so that wet collodion period went up to about 1880 and a little bit later. By that point, somebody came up with a gelatin dry plate negative. At that point, a photographer could buy a box of the glass negatives, and presto, just put it in the camera in the dark, take the image. So it cut out all of those cumbersome steps of the wet collodion process. Also in the 1880s, a lot of amateur photographers started making their own photographs, and I'll talk about that when we get to the snapshots. But if you have glass negatives, they make wonderful scans. You're lucky if you have this. You always want to scan from the earliest generation possible. So if you have the glass negative, it will have so much more detail than even the first print with it, because that would have likely faded through the years. If you have them, just keep them, usually store them upright. You don't want to stack a lot together and to add the weight, because that can crack them. And they really need to be in a dry environment. You don't want it to be humid, because that will cause that gelatin to swell and flake. This is the type of box we use in library archives. You can buy 4-flap enclosures. It's bad for them to slide them in and out of a paper sleeve, because they can flake. So here's just a few examples of glass negatives that we've scanned. Here's an early selfie. So this is probably about 1905. This is an amateur photographer, and you can see here that he's holding a cable bulb, a cable release that's attached to his shutter. So he's taking his own photograph there. And so most of the photographs between 1880s sometime and up until the 19 teens or so, in studios were made from glass negatives. They made glass negatives as late as the 1950s because they didn't dimensionally shrink. So astronomers particularly like them as they're photographing the stars because they can do measurements. The film will shrink. But they came up with film because it's lightweight, it doesn't break, but it had problems from the very beginning. So they used a cellulose nitrate that was very, very unstable. And so the best example I can show is this motion picture film. But sheet film would do this too. Stored together in high humidity and high heat, it will outgas nitric acid. And that will then attack other photographs nearby. It has 5 or so stages of deterioration. They will fade, they will get sticky, they will ooze. And an older librarian at the State Library told me she remembered a film collection at the State Library oozing out of the cans. The bad thing about this, the really bad thing, besides losing our visual history, is that it's dangerous. So it can spontaneously combust. So there was a well-known fire in the early 1920s in Cleveland Hospital in an X-ray department that started a fire. It wasn't the fire that killed people, but the fumes did, and 20-some people died in that fire. And so there was a real rush to get a safety film. So they came up with acetate, or they're stamped along the side. I don't see it here, maybe up here. It will say safety film. And this is a better, a safer kind of film. However, over time, they found that it will shrink. So an 8 by 10 inch negative will become 7 by 9 inch. And there are layers of the emulsion, the film on it, and it has nowhere to go but to wrinkle like this. This also outgasses an acetic acid, so it smells like vinegar, and it just goes fast in high humidity. So a lot of museums, if they can afford it, will have cold storage vaults for their film collections. And that's why there's been an effort to get them digitized as well. But you usually won't find a big enough quantity in your collections at home to really have to worry about these fires. You may find this if you have enough of the larger ones. So with the negatives, going back to the glass negatives then, they started making prints. And of course this was wonderful because you could order as many prints as you want. It was good for the photographer, it was good for the buyers. So I'm not getting into all of these processes, but albumin, which is made of a salted egg white as sort of the binder or the glue that holds the silver to the paper, it was used from about late 1850s up until 1890 is when I generally cut off. It can go a little bit later. So I'll just show you the pictures because that's the better way to explain it. What happens is high humidity causes these to fade. So they lose the highlight detail. They start out as a neutral blackish brown or purplish color, and over time they turn this color. This isn't sepia toned. They didn't do this on purpose. This was just fading. Here's another bad example of real bad fading, but I included this because it was the Crawfordsville Schoolhouse. Does anyone know where this was?
That would be on, there are these 4 streets. I think that one of them's Seminary Street, and I think that one of them's College Street. Is that right? It's where the second high school was there because in 1890 there was a fire in the chemistry area. It burned down, and then the second high school was built on that land.
Okay, well good. We haven't had time to look in the Sanborn maps yet and to figure it out, but that'll give us a place to start. So thank you. But so you can see, usually they're darker on the edges. They start fading.
It's the Athena Center now.
What's it called?
The Athena Center.
Athena Center. Okay, all right. I'll try to remember that.
It's Jefferson and College.
Jefferson and College? I couldn't see who said that, but thank you. Okay.
Is it?
Mhm.
And so based on the photographers, and I have, I think, over 4,400 Indiana photographers so far, it really helps us narrow down these dates. So if you ever have questions, we'll have that online eventually. Here's just another one. This is more like the original color of these albumin photographs. So if you have photos 1860 to 1890, more than likely they are going to be this albumin process. And then there were lots of different sizes of trends or fads of the mount size. And you'll have this for reference, but I'll just show you a couple of the most common ones. Cartes de visite, visiting cards in French, are about 2.5 by 4.5 inches, give or take 1/4 of an inch. And cabinet cards, 4.5 by 6.5. And so the reason these albumin photographs are mounted onto cardboard is because if you didn't mount them, they would roll up real tight, almost like a pencil. So they had to mount them flat. They used wheat starch paste, mount them onto this thin cardboard or mount board that they could buy. So, cartes de visite, I already said the size. They were stored in these albums, usually, and they changed through the years. So there's a good book on dating these, but generally if it's small with more squarish corners, it's usually 1860s. If it has a double gold line, 1860s. This fine more in the mid-1860s. The bigger and the kind of fancier the photographer's imprint is, either on the front or the back, and plus showing more of the image and the Victorian background. This gets me more into the 1880s era. Okay, so one more quiz for you. Clothing is one of the best clues for dating your photographs. Through 1966, 67 or so. You also see that they have a real wood column, real wood balustrade, so that looks very typical 1860s. Going by the photographer's information, when they have an oval like this and they're convex, so they're stamped to have depth to them, that gets that into the mid-1870s. In this particular case, I love the way they wrote the year on it, but didn't say who it was. So always get those names on the back. Whoops. A couple other clues from cartes de visite. If they have a tax stamp on the back, this was used from 1864 until 1866. It was a revenue stamp to raise money for the North during the Civil War. They taxed luxury items like chewing tobacco and playing cards and photographs. So the Photographers Association was formed. They were called the National Photographers Association, I believe. And if you were a member, you could use the logo on the back in the 1870s. Also in the 1870s, the name is diagonal quite a bit, so I find that is helpful. Beware that just because you have a photograph of General Sherman or President Lincoln or the Haywards, whoever they were, that doesn't mean your family knew them. They probably bought them in a stationery store and just added them to your family album. Cabinet cards then came about 1870. Everyone, their albums were filled. They really needed a new trend to keep people buying photographs. So these are larger. And the problem with them was, on a carte de visite, your head could be maybe an inch or 3/4 of an inch, and you wouldn't see any imperfections. By this time, your head could be 3 inches on an image, and photographers' journals were full of horror stories of people yelling at them because you could see every flaw, every wrinkle, every pimple. And so they started hiring a lot of retouchers, a lot of young women and daughters and wives who were working. And she has this, the negative here, lights coming through, so she's retouching the negative. This one I just point out real quickly. It's a medical novelty image because I found out he was club-footed. And so this is one that sold for $400 on eBay. So even if you think your photographs don't have any value or you don't know who they are, somebody likely collects whatever you have. And of course, with the camera, that's valuable as well. So cabinet cards could be multiple people standing up. Usually the photographer identified themselves as advertising. They would go out into groups like this. Beware, people always think that a uniform means it's Civil War. Look at your reference books on uniforms. This is 1880s based on this kind of purplish brown mount. And he was probably a uniform, or a military soldier, perhaps working in the Indian Wars. Who knows? I don't know the uniform. Here's one made here in Crawfordsville. Willis Gallery was in business here for a long time, and if it was a woman photographer too, she took over for her husband. So, and see the wonderful paper mache prop.
Do you know when she operated the Willis Gallery?
I have that information that I can get to you. Interesting story. Her husband went west. It involved a murder, that family murder. It's a whole story probably. Did I see another hand over here? Okay. Like I say, I look at the back not only for the name of the photographer, but by the style of it. And there are books about dating those as well. Thought you'd like to see just another view of what it was like to be photographed. They had these large skylights or side lights that would let the natural light in. They had all of these different props, and the photographer had a variety of cameras. This was about 1905. Okay, a couple warnings. Even if you know this is a cabinet card, it's dated to 1890s, I know, based on the photographers, the town. It's gilded, it has the cutout edges, so that dates to the 1890s. But be very critical of what the subject is, because this is a copy photograph of an older image. So as you know, the daguerreotypes and early images were one of a kind. I can just imagine she's long gone, her grandchildren are nostalgic, they take that one and only image of grandma to be photographed, and they just print it in whatever style was popular at the time. So based on that tarnish line and her style and her hair, she's probably 1840s, rephotographed 1890s. Ways you can tell they're copies, sometimes you can see the edges, and they're also just a little soft focus. So she's probably in 1870s based on her choker and everything, maybe 1860s in an 1880s mount. So be very critical when you're looking at those. I think I forgot one other point there. Oh, I put it someplace else. Never mind. Okay, 1900, they started getting all sorts of formats, so it's harder to date them by the size. I want to point out in this one, though, she's wearing a photo button of a loved one. So from late 1890s up until 1915 or so, there were people like this who would take your old photos, make copies of them, and they would make these little buttons that you could wear as a brooch or just a pin. I read an account saying during the Spanish-American War, the men who were cleaning up the bodies on the battlefield said the ground was littered with the photo buttons of loved ones who didn't yet know that their soldier was dead. A very touching kind of story, but they were popular at that time. Crayon enlargements were these early types of enlargements where they would take the glass negative, project it onto photosensitive paper. There were a variety of methods of doing this, but in this case, the light reflected on a mirror it would bounce onto here. And these could take hours. And so they were light images, so they would go over them with charcoal or pastel or India ink, all sorts of artist materials. But they were called crayon enlargements because crayon wasn't waxy, it was pastel. So sometimes they're just monochrome like this in black and white. Other times they were more fully colored. But these hung in the parlors, and a lot of times they were in the curved convex glass. And just be very, very careful with these because they mounted them on very brittle acidic cardboard. They break just sometimes, it seems like, just by looking at them. And if they've been taken out of that frame and they're curved, you need to be very careful that they're stored separately in a box. I usually crumple up tissue paper and make a little pillow for it so it rests on that paper so you don't add pressure to the edges. Okay, cyanotype, popular even earlier than this, 1860 through 1920, are these blue photographs that are related chemically to a blueprint. And so they weren't used for portraiture in studios, but a lot of amateur photographers used them because they were easy to do and could be washed with water. You could even coat fabric and make quilts out of them. The folder or easel photos start maybe even earlier, maybe around 1899 up to the present. And these are the photographs, like most senior photos, they're slipped into freestanding easels or folders like this. And what I like to do with these is put a piece of acid-free tissue paper before I shut those flaps so they're protected from the acidic material. All right, snapshots, and I don't know where I am in time. Can anyone tell me what time it is? 17 after. Okay. Okay. All right, so we're doing okay then. So snapshots come about in 1888 as good a start date as any. Of course, any photographer could make casual snapshots before, but a number of things happened at this point to make it a lot easier. They had faster film. They started making roll film and also plastic-based film. You no longer needed a tripod like you did for the longer exposures and the weight of those heavy cameras. And also George Eastman came along of Kodak, and he was the marketing genius who realized that he could make a lot of money on this. So there are a number of Brownie cameras and these early cameras that Kodak marketed. They also sold the film and they did the processing. So the first cameras in 1888 that Kodak was popularly selling were little boxy cameras. They had film, 100 images on a roll of film. The slogan was, you push the button and we do the rest. So you would take those images, you pull a string and do a crank, but you would take all those images, send the camera, film and all back to Rochester, New York, where they had primarily women who were working in these rooms that looked like greenhouses with skylights, and they were putting the film, they developed the film, they would have to process in these little contact printers one image at a time with the sunlight coming in as their light source. They still mounted them on cardboard. They filled your camera up and sent it all back to you. That was about $25, so that was pretty expensive. So at first it was the upper middle class who were really into photography. But old George Eastman was smart about it, so he realized he should market to women and children. And his slogan was, so easy, even women and children can do it. He had snapshot women who, I think he also might have realized that children would waste a lot of film. So he realized that he lowered the price of the cameras, and he realized the money was to be made in the processing and the film. So at this point, from a social historian's point of view, we really start seeing what life was like. People smiled for the camera. We can see what their yards really look like. They're not just dressed for the photographer that day. You can see parties. They start shooting with flash so they can take interior images. It's just a wonderful era where we start seeing how people see themselves. Be just really mindful of what you're looking at. There are all sorts of clues. My eye always went to the GAR banner. I was looking at the flags to see if I could date the flag, because in 1912 that changed. It wasn't until I talked to several groups that somebody said that there's a date there as well. So be mindful of the obvious clues as well. But look at, do you have a Civil War vet in your family? Was there a parade in town that day? Is that their house? You can sometimes find newspaper articles talking about these events. Cars are another just wonderful, wonderful clue that I'm bad at, but there are a lot of really good books on dating cars. I tend to zoom in on the license plates, and if anyone goes to the Indiana Album webpage, I have a license plate dating guide for every Indiana license plate. We didn't start putting the year on them till 1913 or so, and even if you can't see the year, you can see enough to date them, so that's been real handy for us. Color photography came about in the 1930s. They came up with a chromogenic color. It's made of dyes. Before that, they were the black and white. That's the cut in Wabash, Indiana, by the way. And I just want to warn you that even if you have photos you think are beyond redemption, that you don't think you can save, somebody came to us with these 3 snapshots of the Indiana State Fair. They were dated September 1900. And after looking at them a while, I realized someone looked out the horticulture building, just took 3 quick pictures, but they overlapped enough so we could make this panoramic photograph out of it. So the magic of Photoshop is that you can enhance the details, but I admit that I got an extra window in here because I didn't know how much it overlapped, and I found out later. So save, even if you think they're really bad, save images like that. Okay, most of our black and white photographs in the 1900s are gelatin silver. Instead of that collodion or egg white, they were using gelatin. Sorry, I thought I turned that off. I'll just let that ring. Anyway, so what happens with this silver gelatin is over time in high humidity, the silver ions can come to the surface. And so they get very shiny like this. It should stop soon, sorry about that. So again, it's important to keep these in a dry environment. Photographic postcards were made at about 1903, 1905, and photographers could buy the photo paper with the photographer's with the address information and the stamp information on the back, and print on them and mail them. So a couple good clues about these. Here's just another one of a photo prop. And just a few more. These are great because sometimes they're very rare. An amateur photographer might have just made 5 or so. Oh, okay, before I get to the dating clues, here's an example of when the stars line up. That starts in 1912. So somebody said here it must be the left-hand drive of the car, so it must be in the 1911 Jones show. And also I'm really aware for our project, what are we not getting and what are we targeting now? We're hardly getting any ethnicity. We're not getting African Americans contributing to us. A lot of times it's because I've been told they're poor families and they didn't take as many photographs. But we're reaching out, really trying to get in the region, and even topics of gay history and women's suffrage. We're starting to target certain topics right now because African Americans are not represented very well digitally online yet. Okay, so here's what I was talking about, the dating clue. If it has the split on the back, correspondence on the left, and address on the right, that dates it to 1907 or later. Before that point, the government would only let you put the address on the one side. You had to write the message on the other side. Of course, the postmark will often have a year on it, and if the stamp isn't there, there are guides online for stamp boxes or stamp blocks that will narrow it down. Panoramic photographs are these very, very long, stretched out photographs. Here's one. I just want to show you some of the problems of scanning these things. If they're cracked and curved, we have lighting issues we have to deal with. But I think, well, hopefully I'll have more of those in a minute. But if you do have the panoramic photographs, they're usually either mounted or framed behind glass. And be careful because they will stick to the glass and it's hard to get it removed. Or you'll have them rolled up tight, and don't force them flat because they will crack. And so you can humidify them, even keep them in the bathroom as you're taking your showers that morning, humidify them a little bit. If that doesn't work, put them in a Tupperware with sponges, wet sponges in little bowls, let it sit for several hours, and then you can flatten and weight them. All right, color photographs, as I said, date to the 1930s, and it's not till 1960 that we have more color than black and white photographs. The problem with the color, though, is they had a choice. We could have had pigment that made up the color, but it was more expensive. The general public wanted dyes because they were cheaper. So just like your curtains in the window, sunlight hits them and they will fade. That's what's happening to our magenta, cyan, and yellow dyes. So if you keep your photographs in the store window, say, and the sunlight's hitting them all the time, the red and yellow will fade and they turn blue. If you keep them in the dark, it's the opposite, and they will turn orange. My childhood is a blurry mess of orange from the 70s particularly. So the only thing that can really prevent this is cold storage, which most of us can't afford or don't want to dedicate a refrigerator for it. But it is really drastic how much they have faded through the years. Kodachrome is one of the exceptions. Kodachrome has been fairly stable, and they stopped making it, and I hear rumor now that they're going to start making Kodachrome, and someone might start processing it again because it's still very beloved because it's, you know, kind of brighter than life colors. Once again, you can use Photoshop and bring out all the details of these, so don't despair about the faded ones. And that goes for negatives, prints, as well as your slides. And so here are just a couple of slides. And we're just loving these for the Indiana album right now. I think I'm getting tired of black and white, so it's so fun to see these vivid colors of the 1950s. For the most part, just keep them in little archival boxes. If you don't use your carousels, get rid of those and just store them in boxes. And you can have them digitized. If you send them away, it's usually like 19 cents or something like that anymore, so the price has gone down. Polaroid came about in 1948. Edwin Land made the Land camera, and he was just a creative genius whose daughter said, "Why can't I see the picture right now?" So he started working on it and came up with this way. And probably most of us are of an age that you can almost smell that squeegee kind of chemical smell. And if it didn't coat it evenly, you find kind of streaky areas on them. But there are dating clues on the back of these. There's a date manufactured code on the back. So there are guidelines online for those. They started making color Polaroids in 1963, and these are hot again. I have millennials working for me, and a couple have said that, you know, you can buy these cameras. They're horribly expensive, and the film's horribly expensive, but it's new and they're still being made. or there's a new owner, I should say. Lots of other processes, so that's why I said I'm only going over the most common one. Just real quickly about the photograph albums, keep them intact almost always. Even though it's bad, black, crumbly paper, even though you worry about slitting this, what I do if I have a precious album like that with brittle paper, I slowly take them out one by one. I wear gloves. I put a piece of paper behind it so I can glide it out. I do an inventory of it and keep that inventory with that album so people won't continually look on the back of those. With some of them are glued in. Those are usually in pretty good condition. These are the ones that people are always tempted to disassemble. And there's really no reason to. Try to keep it cool, dry, and dark, wrap it in tissue, keep it in a box. I've seen bad cases where people will look at both sides and decide which one's more valuable and cut it out and sacrifice the other side. But there's no need to do that. If it's crumbling so bad that the photo edges are exposed, maybe then. But for the most part, keep it together like this, because there might be a context or story that you'll lose if you take them out. Another thing I learned is if you're lucky enough that your ancestor wrote names on there, they're usually incomplete. So I went through with my several of my relatives in different albums, and I would note that it said Grandpa on farm. She would tell me, this is Amos Hostetler in the Monroe Township farm in Kosciuszko County, and we would try to date them. And then I put a note in the front of the album saying, originally identified by so-and-so, and I would say who I was when we re-identified it. So talk to people in the future so they'll know. And always be clear if you're uncertain. That's become one of my pet peeves, is people will just say, well, it must be this person. So they'll write it down like it's gospel. And if you're trying to figure it out, write down those clues. Maybe they'll know and have other photos to compare it to in the future. But if you have these, and newspaper clippings are on one side, which will damage photos when the pages are closed, you can put acid-free tissue paper between them to preserve them, or to help them. Now, in this case, this is the example of always get them out of here. These are the so-called magnetic albums that came about in the 1960s. That's where my childhood photos went when I was a child. These are bad for a number of reasons. It's the wrong kind of plastic. It's the wrong kind of cardboard in there. It's a glue with sulfur in it. It leaves stripes as you try to pull them off. Either that adhesive is not aggressive enough and your photos will fall out, or more likely it is so stuck that it's hard to get out. So the best clue for removing these is take unscented, preferably dental floss. And what I try to do is just first take a thin micro spatula and put it under there and try to pop it. Sometimes they pop out. Then I take that, wrap it around my fingers like I'm flossing, get it under a corner, and then you can kind of just shave back and forth. And with the wax, it sometimes will get that image off of there. Then the problem is all of your photographs are going to be sticky on the back because they have a little bit of adhesive residue. So I try to have its secondary album ready to go. I try to reassemble it in the same order if it makes any sense, and just put them right in with the photo corners, and that way they won't all stick together or block together. But yeah, those are horrible.
You've talked a lot about acid-free paper and special boxes. Where does one find those?
Yeah, this is kind of difficult. I usually go to two companies. Gaylord Products is one. You can find their catalog online. And the other one is University Products. Gaylord and University. And I am a comparison shopper because they are really expensive. You know, all of this stuff is horribly expensive. So what I will do is wait till they have a 40% off sale. Once you get on their list, they're going to bombard you. Wait till they have a sale. And then sometimes I'll either call the other
Which company?
Gaylord and University.
And they date photographs.
No, these are for the archival supplies.
Okay.
Yeah, so these are for the acid-free and archival supplies. So I will play them against each other and call and say, hey, they'll do, especially if I'm buying a lot at the same time. So just try to work with those. Sure would be nice if we had a archival co-op in the state where we all could buy in bulk together, but nobody has put that together yet. So look at this when you get home if you want. These are some of my other favorite sources for dating images. This is one where you can upload a photograph and it will crawl the web looking for another example of it. And so here's a challenge I had. They thought this round barn was in Indiana. They wanted to use it in a publication. They didn't know where it came from. So I put it out in 10i, and boom, this came back. Just a little crop of it from the Bartholomew County Historical Society. Lo and behold, that told me it's probably near Columbus. And I was able to then look up Round Barns, Bartholomew County. We were able to figure out the little girl and her age and date it. So once in a while you get really lucky, especially for buildings. Another clue is when you're trying to identify your family photographs. Probably all of you have read. Some of us are called recognizers, or there's another term for it. I can't think of the more scientific one. But
Autobiographical memory.
That sounds good. Super autobiographical memory.
Hyperthymesia.
Very good. Okay. And that isn't what I was thinking of those terms, but yeah, that's the same thing, undoubtedly, where we just know we're good at faces and we know some people just are bad at it. So I've always been good. I can look at these. They're obviously not identical twins, but I can tell which is which one. Can most of you tell who is who? Yeah, by the chin. I'm surprised some people look at this and say, I would have no idea. I have no clue. So find the people in your family who are the good people at that, who have a good eye for recognizing people. Other things I try to do is if I have a lot of pictures of the same people, I try to line them up to do comparison and get them in chronological order. So this is my great-great-grandmother, and I think I pretty much have her lined up by age. And a good clue is, like I said, our ears. So she has a detached earlobe, which I inherited, so says my DNA test. So a detached earlobe, there's a unique shape to it that she had going way back, even though they've gotten bigger. So I compare the ears, I look at the eye color, I look at the body shape, the ear shape, the chin shape, whatever I can. And after I got it all lined up, I realized she's wearing that same watch slide and watch chain, I guess it is. And then it dawned on me, I have that part of it. So it really became special to me. But if you can line them up, if you're lucky enough to have identified photographs of them, you can figure it out. Another thing I learned is that if you have family who moved into another state, contact their descendants. So I got a hold of a third cousin. We drove out to Kansas to visit her. Our photographs of her family are identified, but our family photographs of like my great-grandparent and the kids aren't identified because we knew who they were. But the photographs that we sent out to them would say Dorrance, age 6. They would have the years on them. So compare family collections, which is easier to do with Ancestry. Be aware that photos are flipped when you're comparing. So this guy wasn't sure if it was the same person, but once we flipped it, and I think he has some eye abnormality too that made us a little more confident that it really was the right fellow. And then when you bother to figure out who is in your photographs, make sure you have a good way of writing it down. So in this particular case, I went all out. It's the only known photograph of everybody. I scanned it. I did this little chart, even telling some of the stories that went along with it. But I'm going to skip through a few of these. I'll show you more about writing on the back. Beware of trick photographs. It happened before Photoshop. This is a man taking a photograph of himself. You can tell the light, the difference in the center. Okay, and then, and I'm sorry, I'm just running out of time for all of this. For the preservation, in a nutshell, I told you a lot of this, but we do the most damage to our photographs by mishandling and misstorage. So don't get in a rush to display them like this or to tape them to a board. That tape will never come off. Don't think that you can fix it yourself with Scotch tape, because it will come off, it'll leave residue. It doesn't do any good for the image itself. Don't tape them, don't laminate them. It's like cooking them in their own juices with those laminators. Here's an example of one that just, it'll never come out of there. Don't ever touch the surface with your fingers. You want to work with clean hands, handle them by the back or the edges, because we have oils in our fingers that will cause damage over time. The mold I've already mentioned. Writing too hard on the back is another big way we damage them. So the pen embossed through and is even discoloring a little bit there. And
excuse me, even the most modern laminating, like if you take it someplace and have it laminated,
right,
it's still won't preserve it?
No, it won't preserve it. There are adhesives inside it that are probably bad for it, but the worst thing is it is permanent. You can never undo the laminating. Now, if you're talking about 2 sheets of Mylar that just have tape along the edges, that's fine. But I'm talking about the heat lamination that puts it inside and presses it together. And a rule of preservation is never do anything that can't be undone. So yeah, I've seen horror stories. It may look great right now, but give it time and it's going to really be bad.
How does it do on newspaper articles?
And I would say newspaper articles are okay, in part because they're usually multiple copies, they're digitized. They're going to deteriorate anyway because they're really acidic paper. And, lignin and acids in them will cause them to turn yellow regardless. So in that case, it may be preserving it. But photographs, definitely not. Civil War letters, anything that you really value, I would avoid those. Work like an archivist. Don't work like this lady with the coffee and the cat and legs up. Try to be neat like an archivist. Try to get your archival boxes and get them organized so it makes sense. Handling, I've said most of this, but no food.
Easier said than done.
Yeah. Food or drinks are one of the worst things. I know scrapbookers like working with their red wine as they're working, but I've seen a lot of red tinted photographs through the years. And keep pets away. I have a cat who likes chewing anything in plastic. So I have cat-free zones where all our photographs are. Environment, you can come back and look at this. There's a lot online, but basically cool, dry, and dark. Just try to keep it in the 68 to 72 degrees range. Color lower. I think the important thing about storage is don't keep your photographs against an outside wall. In the basement, in the attic, you want them in a comfortable air-conditioned space in your house. Writing on the back. This is our toolkit for almost everything I work on. I like these woodless graphite pencils they're very soft, and they will even write on the back of those resin-coated slick snapshots. So that works well. If it doesn't work, I will use either a white Prisma pencil on dark mounts or a black one or gray one on the back of slick photographs. A number 2 pencil will work. You don't want to have a hard, sharp pencil to write on the back. A couple things about writing on your photographs. Some are just impossible to write on. When I was off in graduate school learning about photo preservation, my dad was taking duct tape to the back of our tintypes and putting a label on and writing on pen. But God love him, now I'm glad he did it. But I should have told him, I didn't know he cared, I should have given him these acid-free sleeves. So you can put tintypes in acid-free sleeves and then write the story on there. I try to say how we know things. Sometimes they need clarification, especially if it's a foreign language or if they don't have the names. I try to spell that out. And beware that sometimes the name on the back isn't the sitter, it's the recipient. So Grandma got 12 photographs and she's going to give them to all her children and her grandchildren, and she's writing on the back, this is to John, this is to Anne. So the name on the back will be who's getting the photograph. So when I have, and I have a lot of those in my family, I will write to who it was given to, and then I will say the real name, and I'll try to explain the relationship to get the idea across. So I think that's really confused a lot of genealogists, understandably, through the years. To display them, the best advice is just don't. You want to save them from fluorescent light, sunlight, ultraviolet light, but we cherish them and we want to see these people. In that case, put them in a back hallway that doesn't have a light on very often. You can invest in UV filtering plexiglass that will cut out some of those harmful rays. Or what I like to do is get a good photocopy, a color photocopy, and frame that, put it on display. Keep your original in the dark. So that's the best, and the safest way to keep them long time. We've gone over, the storage, but you can invest in these boxes, acid-free, lignin-free, and all of this is spelled out on the web, so you can really look for good quality materials. And you can buy any size box or sleeve that you need for them. I like, for my precious photographs, to provide 3 layers. I put them in a paper sleeve, I put them with a group in a folder, and then I put that in a box. So that keeps some of the cycling of the temperature and humidity away, or it slows it a bit. So I'm going quickly through that because some of this gets more in-depth for museums. Albums, like I said, I like wrapping them in tissue paper and putting them in boxes and just keeping them flat. And if you keep them on display, people are going to look at them, the grandchildren are going to come and look at them, and you just have to weigh, is it more valuable for them to know their roots, or is it more valuable for me to keep this? Maybe you can get it out once a year and force it on them, as I have to do with our grandkids. Okay, so that, and color is just out of our, for the average homeowner, it's hard to do this, but cold storage is the best for that. So, well, I'm sorry I've gone so long, but you have all been interested in asking good questions, and I'm glad to stay as long as you guys say I can answer a few questions. And like I said, feel free to contact me through this PowerPoint presentation. And are there any general questions? Yes. Oh, thank you. I think there were one or two of you.
I have a question about your project, the Indiana album
Yes.
project, and say we bring photographs and you scan them and you put them into this album. How are those made available to other people, and what can they do with them?
Okay, so, and I do have the site up here, so one second. So this is the site that you can go to find them. I'm not sure if this is what you're asking. So this is the online source. Someone name a town or a subject.
New Richmond.
What was it?
New Richmond.
New Richmond, okay.
And so when you're searching online, you have to put it in quotes. New Richmond. Okay. Yes, we have a few things. So, and where is that? Is that Montgomery?
It's in Montgomery County.
Oh, okay, okay. I'd forgotten. Anyway, so if we want to see one of these, do any of these strike you?
The school.
You want to see this one? Okay. This is a great school interior. So people can come and find the metadata. So, and also note that we take corrections. So on every record there's a send us feedback button, and we welcome addresses, corrections. If you know like a maiden name of somebody, we add records like that all the time. So somebody who finds it can bring it up so they can see it a lot larger. And then if you want to order a copy, pretty much for any purpose, and I have a copy of our license and deed of gift up here, but I screened them. We haven't had anything I've refused yet. If somebody wanted a photograph of somebody and said they wanted it to illustrate an article about AIDS research in the 1980s, we wouldn't allow them to use something like that, but we would let them use them for books, school reports, to hang in restaurants. That's a popular thing that people want to do. A lot of genealogy. We let anybody take this, which is a pretty high resolution one. We let them right click, copy it, save it, and we want them to use these. So you can use this for any purpose. We want them on Ancestry, Find a Grave, anywhere you want. It's only when Coca-Cola comes calling, we want to make a little money on it. Or if someone's doing a commercial book, we do ask for a little bit, and that just helps us get more. Did that get at the heart of?
I think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Did you have a question too?
Well, just the photos that I have are of a family that went to the gold rush and lived in that area and were, not repressed for 50 years. Most people.
The gold rush of California?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. You have old photos then.
Yeah, I do. But when I look at them, I think, well, they probably weren't in the latest style. I mean, the years that you gave, I'm thinking maybe you would adjust that almost a decade or something.
For the clothing?
Well, if you were using that as a clue to figure out. I mean, most of them have been written on. I know who they are.
Yeah,
they
yeah.
were taken, but I don't all of them.
I've been surprised, in a lot of fashion books and clothing curators have said, even in remote towns in the West, the women weren't as far behind on fashions as you might think.
Really?
Because, and I've noticed this in a lot of clothing that I've seen, where 1890s they start having the big puffy sleeves. Women would just modify their older clothing, and they were all seamstresses, so they would modify the sleeves. So when I look at photographs of a group of people, I always look at the youngest woman, because she's going to be the most fashion conscious. So I look at her, but it is true, the older people don't care. So they might wear a dress from 20 years ago. Men have older. So the older they are generally, but people pretty much keep up. But there are regional differences, I'm sure. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
yeah. All right, any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I want to thank...
Wait,
okay.
where do you recommend, I don't know, CVS, Walgreens to drop off VHS tapes and photo negatives for them to copy them to digital? I mean, do they still do that, or?
I don't know. I've gone to Costco a couple times, and
There's actually a new company here in Crawfordsville
Yeah.
that does it.
oh,
They've
good.
been
they're really
open for
good.
a year. They're in the Enterprise building, which is the one they made
Mm-hmm.
funky with wood siding.
They
What's the name of that business?
I can't remember, she
Um,
gave me her
it's
card,
something
it's
media.
Diana Shelton is who it is.
Enterprise buildings.
Yeah,
It's on Market Street.
yeah, and they basically take, and they will do movies and pictures and
They'll do
everything.
sound
Put it all
even.
digital.
It's called digital media,
Okay, that's good.
and,
Yeah.
and they did like 100 and some rolls of film
they're-
for me, and they did a fantastic job.
Yeah, and they're very careful, they wear
Yes.
gloves when they're doing it.
And do they process it locally?
Yes, they do
Oh.
it
They
in
do
their
it all
shop,
there.
so it
That's
doesn't
good.
go anywhere. You take it to them, it stays with them.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Okay, good. Yeah, and it's always a good idea to ask local museums, local libraries, because they keep up with that type of thing. Yeah.
Their reason, I mean, they did some slides for me that have been damaged by water,
Wow.
and they cleaned them all up, and they made them look like new. I mean, they really did an excellent job. It's not, when I took my slides in originally that I wanted copied to Walgreens, the girl said, "Oh, I've never seen these," and grabbed the slide with her fingers, and it's like, "Don't touch that," and she looked at me like I was the Wicked Witch of the West or something.
Yeah.
But, a digital media did a great job.
All right, good to know. Well, I don't want to keep them too much longer, but thank you all for your good questions. And please come back Saturday, go through